Welcome to Temporal Clauses, Part 2, to go with sections 144 and 145 of Hansen and Quinn's Greek, an intensive course. You'll find the material in this video on pages 547 and 548 of Hansen and Quinn. We covered temporal clauses and the fact that they are about the timing of the main clause. They tell you something about when things are happening in an earlier section, section 97, and we talked about epei, epeidae, and hote, and how epei and epeidae and other conjunctions like it tell you about action prior to the main clause, and hote and other conjunctions like it tell you about action simultaneous with the main clause. What we didn't talk about are actions subsequent to, after the main clause. And here we're going to use the conjunctions heos, which can mean so long as or while, and that's when it's being simultaneous, but also until, and it does that for subsequent meaning, and sometimes in English so long as does subsequent meaning as well. Mekri does the same things. And we also have the conjunction prin, which can mean before and until. Prin will get some of its own special rules, and we'll talk about those later. So I don't know if you remember from the other video that I like to do things a little bit differently from Hansen and Quinn, and I suggested that you think about the conjunction and the verb type and the implication of what's in the temporal clause when you are going to translate, rather than their chart that looked a lot like conditional sentences. And we could add subsequent clauses and subsequent conjunctions to this chart if we wanted to, and complete it with these new ideas. If I try to do lines here and everything, it's going to be quite the spider's web. So let's take out the things that we've already learned and start to think about what happens with each of these conjunctions and the different sorts of verbs that they can appear with. First, there's the indicative. Again, the negative for temporal clauses in the indicative is u, and we're talking about factual events. So let's look at a couple of examples. Emachamen, mechri, and nikesa. And what we have there is, I was fighting until I won. So the idea there is that the winning happened after the fighting, was subsequent to the fighting, and it's a factual event. And this is how English expresses the same idea. We could also have emechamen haos and nikon, and we would translate that, I was fighting as long as I was winning. Now the difference there between until and as long as has to do with aspect. Until is how you're going to translate it if you have the choice, which you do with mekri and haos, if the verb of the temporal clause is simple aspect and nikesa is aorist. But if it is progressive repeated aspect and nikon there in the imperfect, then as long as makes sense. And that's the way you tell the difference there and gives you a nice way to choose. We can also see how prin works here. Uk agrapsa prin hadidaskalos moi ekelersen. And we could translate that, I did not write until the teacher ordered me. So with the indicative, really the best way to translate prin is going to be until. I told you that there would be a few special rules for prin, and one of them is that you're usually going to see prin and the indicative only when the main clause is negative. Now, it's not a hard and fast rule. It's not every single time, but almost always the main clause is negative. I didn't do something until something else. So now let's move on to the next part of our chart. And the next part of our chart had verbs in the optative in the temporal clause. Here, I want you to be very careful with my video. Skip this or proceed with caution. This doesn't appear in Hansen and Quinn. These are clauses that would be extremely rare in Greek that you might see anywhere, so you can just skip on to the subjunctive if you like. Here, these conjunctions, subsequent conjunctions with the optative, tend not to mean general or customary events in the past, but might mean something where the result is indefinite, where the speaker doesn't know what's going on. So, for example, ha geragos ekhamnen heos ha despotes auton kalesean, which we could translate as, the farmer was working until the master called him. We're not sure if the master ever showed up, but that's the indefiniteness. That's the implication there of the optative. But you're really not going to find that very often, and there's even some dispute about whether that's really what's going on. More common, although still quite rare, is with the optative and one of these conjunctions that's subsequent, that it's talking about an action that the people in the sentence anticipated at some time in the past. So an example here would be emenon heos elthoi, and English would translate that, they waited until he came. The implication is they remained expecting that he would come. So it's talking about their expectation about something else happening in the future, and that's why the optative is there. To see the difference between that and other much more common uses of temporal clauses, you might look at this example, emenon heos elthen, where we've got the indicative in the temporal clause, and we would translate that, they waited until he came, but the implication is that he actually did come. We know when he came, and that's how long they waited. And that we would do with the indicative. That's much more common, and you're really not going to see the optative with these conjunctions very often at all. And if you do, it's probably something more complicated with indirect statement. So let's move on to the subjunctive. The negative is may, and here again you're going to add on to the conjunctions. These don't form their own separate kinds of words. You simply add an on, and here are some examples. Mahumai, haos an nikesomen. So it's something that's going to happen in the future, generally speaking, maybe anticipated, but it hasn't happened yet. And so we're going to translate, I will fight until we win. And another example, Mahumai mechrian and tautha meneta. I will fight as long as y'all stay here. Again, the difference between until and as long as has to do with aspect. So nikesomen is aorist subjunctive, and therefore we're going to translate until. And meneta is present subjunctive, so we'll translate as long as. With prin, again, it's usually going to happen with negative sentences. U tous politas paideose, there it is a negative main clause. And that's going to be, she will not educate the citizens, prin an ta biblion grapse, until she writes the book. So usually negative main clause, and then we're going to use the translation until with prin, with finite verbs. That is to say, we've seen prin now with the subjunctive and with the indicative, and prin and those finite verbs, those verbs with person and number, we're going to translate until. Prin also can appear with the infinitive, and that's when it's going to mean before. Adidaxen tous politas prin apelthein. You can translate that, she taught the citizens before going away. If you need a subject for that infinitive prin clause, of course, as is true with all infinitives, if you need a subject, you're going to use an accusative. So an example might be angele tein nike, prin tous kerukas elthein. She will announce the victory before the heralds come, and there tes kerukas is in the accusative to be the subject of elthein. So we can again set out the chart of conjunction and verb type with a translation, sort of default translation. With these conjunctions, we have these verb types. I'm just leaving out the optative. You can just ignore that. You're going to run into it so rarely. And we'll get these patterns. You can get these subsequent conjunctions with the indicative and simply say, as long as she, whatever the indicative verb is, and do as long as if that indicative verb is in progressive repeated aspect. All three conjunctions can say until she, indicative verb, if it's in the simple aspect. Add an on, and haos or mechri can mean as long as she verbs, if that's a progressive or repeated subjunctive. And it can mean until she verbs if it's any of the three conjunctions with on and a simple aspect subjunctive. And then, of course, prin with the infinitive can mean before verbing or before she verbs. So again, I would say that temporal clauses really aren't that difficult. If you know what your conjunction means and you pay a little bit of attention to the verb type, it's really pretty simple to add those things together and get a translation in English that conveys accurately what the Greek is doing. So that's your video for the second part of temporal clauses, sections 144 to 145. This time I got a little bit of help.